Welcome, everyone. My name is Tina Sachs. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare here at UC Berkeley. I'm also the incoming faculty chair for the Center on Research on Social Change here at ISSI. And welcome. Thank you all so much for coming. Before we get started, I just want to thank our co-sponsors, Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies and the Center for Race and Gender. And I'd also like to announce an event that may be of interest to you. On Wednesday, October 24th, ISSI will host The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption, presented by Nikki Jones with respondent Clarence Ford. And this event will take place from 4 to 5:30 in Dwinell 117, and we have some flyers in the lobby for more information if any of you are interested. I'd also like to ask you all to turn off your cell phones. And the format for today is that Professor Das Gupta will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period. And it is really my pleasure to introduce Professor Monisha Das Gupta, Professor of Ethnic Studies and Women's Studies at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Her first book, Unruly Immigrants, Rights, Activism, and Transnational South Asian Politics in the United States, analyzed women's, queer, and labor organizing in South Asian communities on the East Coast in the late 20th century. Her most recent articles, based on her research on anti-deportation organizing in the United States, appear in Gender and Society and Latino Studies. Currently, she is working on a book project tentatively titled Settling Migration, Migrant Organizing in an Era of Deportation and Dispossession. Please join me in welcoming Professor Monisha Das Gupta.
Thank you, Tina, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks to the Center for Research on Social Change, the Department of Ethnic Studies, Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies, and the Center for Race and Gender for hosting me today. I want to thank Deborah, Tina, of course, and Shari Solars for their help in making all the arrangements for the trip and making it very smooth. I'd also like to thank Maria Heredia, who's not here, but she very graciously rearranged my trip when I wasn't able to come last semester. And I know that Chris Cepeda Milan is not here anymore, but I appreciate his extending the first invitation to me. I also want to say that I've been very deeply influenced by Katharina Ooms from the Land of Shadows in writing this chapter, and she has read a version of this chapter, and I've tried to respond to some of her comments. I may not be able to restrict myself to 45 minutes. It might go over a little bit, but I will try my best. So this chapter is part of a book on which I'm working, and like all chapters, I'm tweaking it and tinkering with it. So I'm hoping that the talk will bring some clarity on this tinkering and reworking. So my book is on anti-deportation organizing, and the focus is on activism that is led by migrants who are documented and undocumented with violent and non-violent criminal convictions. Such migrants are not easily defensible, and they are more or less shunned by the mainstream immigrant rights movement. I'm writing this book at a time when deportation has reached a mass scale, and every day we hear some new atrocity that has been directed at immigrants or refugees, and refugees. These are times when we need evidence of steadfast struggle against this kind of dehumanization. I hope that the account I will offer today of the courageous and feisty activism of Khmer teenagers in Long Beach, who are part of the Khmer Girls in Action, will lift your spirits in these very putrid times. The tagline for Khmer Girls for Action is "Like a lotus we rise," and as you may know, lotuses bloom in mud and muck. I hope to bring alive for you how the young KGA members organized to transform the harshness of their refugee realities. On December 9, 2017, the Khmer Girls in Action, in partnership with other Cambodian-led organizations who had deep roots in the community, held a forum that was titled Not Home for the Holidays in the auditorium of the Martin Luther King Park Community Center in Long Beach. The walls of the auditorium were decorated with colorful signs painted by the KGA teenagers. And one of the signs says, "It's the season for justice." The forum was precipitated by the impending removal of 70 Cambodian refugees with felony records held in immigration and customs detention centers across the United States during the holiday season. I joined more than 150 community members at that forum, and since then, around December 21st, a judge actually managed to stay the deportation orders, but it's just a temporary stay. The KGA's young women leaders shared the stage with elders in the community to talk not only about the tearing apart of their families as a result of deportation, but also the unrelenting poverty, high unemployment, the lack of adequate housing, poor physical and mental health, the lack of safety as a result of heavy policing, and the lack of educational support. The range of issues covered by the KGA reflected the KGA's approach. It recognizes deportation as one symptom of the community's experience of 50 years of political and structural violence and trauma. The refugee voice that KGA cultivates speaks in the same breath about refugee, gender, racial, and economic justice, breaking out of the discursive mold of immigration reform talk. So very quickly, I just wanted to show you just the stuff that I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk a little bit about my methods after I go through my argument, and then talk about Long Beach as a space that is constructed by the failure of refugee resettlement as well as indigenous dispossession. And then two themes around criminality, deportability, and the KGA's training that deportation is genocide. In doing so, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the forum. A high school student in the KGA's 3-year leadership program, Jocelyn Kong, and Jocelyn is right there behind Keep Families Together, whom I met during my fieldwork at KGA in the previous year, shared the story of her aunt, who was among the 70 people who were put in deportation. Her aunt had moved to Long Beach in 1992 and was settled in a very poor neighborhood. All her life, her aunt had struggled with immense poverty. When she became a teenage mother, she coped with deteriorating mental health by using drugs. She was incarcerated several times for her drug use, and now she's being detained at an ICE detention center for removal as a criminal alien. Jocelyn, who had taken responsibility for her family at a very young age, tried to imagine her life without her aunt. Her aunt had encouraged her to stay in school and brought her food when she needed it, as well as she bought her shoes and given her school supplies, even in her state of economic distress. Reflecting on the fear of deportation that hung over her family, Jocelyn said, "All you have is family and we support each other. Without family, there is no history. Without history, we have no identity." This passionate declaration encapsulates a core lesson of KGA, no history, no self. So it's like KNO, KNO. Students have repeated that to me so many times. In deportation organizing, stories of women detainees and deportees are very rare. Rarer still is the presence of an Asian American and feminist organization that puts young refugee women's leadership at the center. Building high school age Khmer girls and women's leadership capacities so that they can become vocal, visible, and recognized in their communities as agents of social change constitutes the core of KGA's work. To know history and self, KGA encourages its youth members to radically interrogate their categorization as refugees and the very concept of the United States as a refuge. The KGA's executive director, Lian Chun, calls it a process, and I quote, coming of consciousness about why they, that is the KGA members and their families, are Cambodians in the United States. The emergent field of critical refugee studies insists that the refugee is more than a descriptor or legal classification. It is an affective category that puts into circulation fuzzy stories and fuzzy warm stories about rescue, rehabilitation, and refugee indebtedness to the United States in order to cover the buildup of structural and political violence that produces the refugee. The political education of KGA helps youth organizers piece together the circumstances that turn their families into refugees. So this line of inquiry excavates the impacts of the United States war making in Cambodia between 1965 and 1973, the rise of the democratic Kampuchea under the Khmer Rouge between 1975 and 1979 as a result of that war, and the United States' very shoddy efforts in the 1980s at resettling those who fled Cambodia and various refugee camps, and they were escaping social and political turmoil. They start to connect their histories of displacement from Southeast Asia to the permanent ejection of Khmer refugees turned criminal aliens from the United States. So, there's sort of this violence at work here where the very people who were settled in the United States are now being forcibly removed from, the so-called space of refuge. They start to examine why their communities settled in metropolitan areas has the highest poverty rates in the country. One aspect of their refugee poverty is law enforcement profiling of Cambodian youth as crime and gang involved. Khmer youth, many of whom are legal permanent residents, become ready targets of local police and punishment regimes in school for gang activity and are fed into the school to prison pipeline. Khmer refugees were the first among Southeast Asian refugees to be deported, starting in 2002 when the Cambodian government, led by Hun Sen, who has a very poor human rights record, brokered a secret repatriation agreement with the United States. The deportees are stripped of their legal residency and permanently exiled from their families. And since the 2002 agreement, more than 700 Khmer legal permanent residents have been deported to Cambodia. They are among the estimated 45,000 persons who are deportable because of criminal convictions. Once more, Khmer refugees are uprooted, this time from their supposed refuge. They are forcibly separated from their loved ones through imprisonment and then through detention and deportation. The removal of family members puts the economic survival of refugee communities and their ability to care for each other, including their elders and ancestors, in jeopardy, exacerbating intergenerational trauma and refugee poverty. The KGA names the United States deportation of Khmer refugees as a form of genocide. In doing so, it destabilizes the connections cemented in state and popular imaginations between the Khmer Rouge and genocide. This violence of forced family separations exists in continuum with the death, destruction caused by the United States secret bombing of Cambodia and the rise and the genocidal rule of the Khmer Rouge. The KGA's naming of the United States as an agent of genocide, of course, brings to the surface the genocidal structures of settler colonialism. In Long Beach, the story of refugee resettlement bumps up against Gabrielino Tongva's struggles to reclaim land and culture as they battle for federal recognition. In this space, we can trace two nested movements, and they are for resilience against genocide, Khmer and Tongva. Not far from Long Beach's Cambodia town lies the historic site of the Tongva village of Puvugna, which stretches downhill from Rancho Alamitos to the California State University at Long Beach. The KGA members' rejection of the United States benevolent story about refugee resettlement peels back the layers of settler colonialism at home, military imperialism abroad, and economic and environmental racism, as well as dispossession, as they structure a space like Long Beach. KGA's formulation of deportation as genocide instantiates a type of power that I sort of flesh out in the entire book, which I call settler carcerality. Here, I have been helped in my thinking by Karen Leong and Myla Vicente Carpio's insight that carceral states work through the state's subjection of communities to, differential subjection to communities' removal, displacement, dispossession, and economic precarity. The carceral state's production of new felonies and felons, in turn, allows the United States to rehearse, sharpen, assert, and entrench its sovereignty over indigenous people, their governance structures, land, and culture. The deportation of Khmer refugees directs our attention to the state project of resettlement as a practice, as an ideology which aims to intensify U.S. survivor authority as the settler state. The United States can project itself as a refuge for Cambodian survivors of genocide by papering over its own genocide of Native Americans and their persistent struggles against it. The induced forgetting of U.S. bombing and the war in Cambodia is a continuation of the memory lapses of our US policies governing indigenous land, peoples, and cultures. And those policies, as you know, were genocidal. In a writing practice which attempts to bring together these layers of struggle in Long Beach, I aim to flesh out the operation of an imperial settler colonial state to better understand the forces through which people are displaced, dispossessed, and resettled. In this book, my desire to bring migrancy and indigeneity together in one frame stems from my location in US-occupied Hawaii. I'm convinced that it is no longer possible to write about migration as a transnational process to spaces like the United States without engaging indigenous people, indigenous politics, and critical indigenous studies. What does it mean for the United States to exercise its power to conditionally settle or remove migrants, withdraw or award rights of residence in a space where indigenous sovereignty already operates? How does one write about migration by always keeping in mind the present tense of indigenous politics and peoples? And this is very, I deal with this every day in a really good and energizing way in Hawaii, where there is a very strong Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement. So I'll talk a little bit about these are, sort of the questions that will guide my analysis, and then I'll talk a little bit about, the KGA, where it is. So the KGA evolved as a program for pregnant Khmer teenagers who successfully organized to institute sexual harassment policies in the Long Beach high schools in the late 1990s into a Khmer youth leadership development and organizing pipeline against the school to prison pipeline for young women and more recently for young men. The organization recruits students from 2 Long Beach high schools, Polytechnic and Wilson, and Polytechnic is fondly referred to as Poly. The students become KGA members, and the leadership development to which they commit is a 3-year process during which they move through this 3-tiered program. So the first year they go through the Young Women's Empowerment Project and the Young Men's Empowerment Program. And those are usually separate throughout the year so that the gender identities can be developed in these, sort of gender exclusive spaces, and people can feel really secure in their identities. And then they move on to Youth Organizing Long Beach, where they learn the organizing tactics and skills. And then they go on the last year, they go on to the Khmer Justice Project, which is when they start to work on campaigns and they lead campaigns. And I'll talk about 2 campaigns, the Every Student Matter campaigns and the Wellness campaign that I witnessed the student leaders engaging in. The KGA works intensively with Khmer youth in each tier, but for their campaigns, they organize with their African American and Latinx peers on their common experiences with state, economic, and gender violence. In this coalitional space, the KGA ensures that the experiences of Cambodian youth do not get lost in the larger sort of Long Beach-wide discussion over discipline, health, and safety. And Chun sort of, Leanne underlines the importance of inserting these voices of Khmer youth so as to live their, experiences of trauma and the experiences of poverty, and to also, as she says, create a resonance for our young people. But it could also echo out to other communities and other folks who are living in Long Beach. I visited KGA for a month between March and April in 2016 to learn about how KGA builds leadership among young people who do not see themselves reflected in the textbooks that they read in their high schools. How do these high school students put into words and beyond that translate into action the multiple layers of state and structural violence? I mean, these are 14-year-olds who are dealing with, specifying structural violence and specifying a refugee experience and, trying to understand US policy. To prepare for my visit, I spent several months developing my research plan and protocol with a key staff member, Ashley Ueda, who served as the liaison between me and and the rest of the organization. And during this period, we decided that I would observe but not participate in the weekly 3 to 6 trainings that were held on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And this is because the emotional safety of that training space had been developed over a long time and through long-term relationships with the staff of the KGA, and it involved uncovering layers of violence, neglect, and forgetting, which were very intense and sensitive topics. So I acted as an observer, and since my goal anyways was to absorb KGA's political education curriculum, I concentrated on the contents of the training, the skills building, and the learning objectives of each of the exercises in the trainings. I was invited to prepare and to participate in a few events, the public events that took place during that time. And at that time, the KGA was spearheading two campaigns. They were the Every Student Matters campaign to create a positive school climate, and the outreach activities at the new, as well as the outreach activities at the new wellness center that was housed in the Roosevelt Elementary School. These campaigns opened my eyes to the connection between organizing for health and wellness, not legible as immigrant rights issues, and organizing against deportation. So, as I was developing my research plan, they kept asking me, what do you want to do? Because this is what we are doing. And I had a lot of difficulty sort of understanding how, a wellness center could be connected to deportation till I had actually arrived there and saw that work. To understand KGA required understanding Long Beach. So I lived there. I moved from the gentrifying area in the near the shore to the heart of Cambodia town in central Long Beach. Cambodia town serves as the commercial, cultural, and residential hub of the city's 20,000 Cambodian residents, and it's the largest Cambodian community, outside of Cambodia. So it's very significant. The blue Cambodia town street signs mark the city's 2007 cultural designation of the business corridor on Anaheim Street that you can see over there, stretching between Atlantic Avenue and Junipero Avenue. Though Latinos constitute the majority of Cambodia town, Asians constitute about 20% of the population, and 70% of Asians are Cambodians in Cambodia town. The city was not equipped to address the needs of Cambodian refugees as they started to migrate to Long Beach in the 1980s. They found themselves inserted in conditions of urban decay. Leanne points out that Long Beach did not provide the language assistance, cultural competency, and mental health support that was needed for this heavily traumatized group of people who found themselves in already impoverished communities and overcrowded housing. And poor school districts. So I'm quoting Leanne here. For the most part, people were left to fend for themselves. You had this explosion of racial tension in a lot of urban communities like Long Beach, where there was already historic discrimination. Gang violence and school dropout rates were only some of the consequences, and I quote, of the very problematic resettlement process Leanne shared with me. Cambodia town, in many ways, instantiates the Long Beach of policy reports, as an economically depressed, polluted, and unsafe city. At the same time, the neighborhood was very rich culturally. So I just wanted to show you some of the, very beautiful murals that dot the Cambodia town, and we see that the public library has the largest collection of Khmer language groups. There were two Buddhist temples that were in the this got turned around. That was in the neighborhood that I was living in on Orange Street, and these beautiful murals. That brighten the walls on Warren Street and Manahana Street, one depicting Long Beach's Cambodians alongside African Americans, and the other fusing the bucolic scene, evoking, this is the one, it evokes sort of rural Cambodia, and then merges it with the port city of Long Beach. And these really, transform the neighborhood and give it a whole different sense than what you discover in policy reports. Near Cambodia town, at the Cal State Long Beach campus, Tongva cultural leaders and educators have engaged in a long battle to save and take care of the sacred site of Buvugna. Since Spanish incursion in 1790, Tonga residents have been scattered from their ancestral lands and urbanized as a result of dispossession. Today, Tonga live dispersed in the area without a land base, but they are organized into 3 councils and are engaged in the decolonial work of cultural revival, caring for ancestral sites, protecting them from the incessant threat of commercial development. While this part of my research is mostly based on secondary materials, I was fortunate last year to take part in the Indigenous Day Ancestor Walk that was organized by the LA and Orange County Tonga and Hashiman communities. And that walk that I did was from it's not a walk because it's a long stretch, so it was from Costa Mesa to the Long Beach, the CSU Long Beach campus. Methodologically, I adopt a critical, the critical juxtaposition, which is a methodology that has been proposed by Ian Espiritu, by considering, and I quote, seemingly disconnected events, communities, histories, and spaces. The histories of U.S. imperialism abroad and domestic colonization, dispossession, and displacement at home, as well as the contemporary work of cultural revival, resilience, and the need to take care of the elderly and ancestors transgenerationally, lie side by side in the space of refugee resettlement. So one of the questions that I'm often asked when I present this work by people who are not so familiar with immigration law is, how did Cambodians even become deportable? Because they are legal permanent residents. They were, given this status when they were admitted as refugees. The KGA curriculum answers this question by contextualizing Khmer deportability in the convergence of U.S. foreign policy in Southeast Asia, U.S. immigration policy, and state and federal criminal laws. This evolving refugee justice approach departs from the standard analyses that we see in the immigration rights movement that focuses on 2 awful 1996 laws, the Legal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. The KGA staff organizers have been developing this national and transnational analysis with the Southeast Asian Freedom Network and the One Love movement. And during this visit, it was introducing this approach to the local community. The KGA members recognize that deportation in their community is fundamentally linked to their criminalization as being gang involved. Most refugees receive their deportation orders as they finish their prison sentences. They were the casualties of a battery of increasingly stringent federal and state laws put in place starting in the 1980s. And those of you, who study sort of criminal justice in California, this the huge set of laws that just came down at that moment. They defined gangs, they imposed gang injunctions and enhanced sentencing for activities marked by law enforcement as gang-related. At the federal level, the criminalization of Southeast Asian refugee youth and efforts to block them from immigration benefits such as naturalization started in the Reagan era. With U.S.-Cambodia repatriation agreement being made in 2002, those who have a criminal record and have not been able to naturalize, almost always because of poverty, risk deportation as a result. I witnessed the criminalization of Khmer youth within days of starting my fieldwork at the KGA. I was invited to join a multiracial group of high school students for a walkthrough at the new wellness center that I was talking about, established in the same complex as the newly built Roosevelt Elementary School that was located on Linden Avenue. On my way to the wellness clinic, I noticed that Long Beach police cars with flashing lights on Atlantic Avenue had stopped 2 youth, and they were being handcuffed at that moment when I was passing them. And they looked like teenagers of color. The youth were sitting on the edge of the sidewalk, their heads lowered and baseball caps pulled over their eyes. That arrest, possibly a common occurrence in the neighborhood, stayed with me as I walked through the well-lighted, airy, and welcoming space of the wellness clinic. The contrast between the 2 projects of responding to the challenges of Long Beach youth, the challenges that Long Beach youth face, could not have been starker. As I listened to our guides introducing us to the reproductive health and mental health services at the clinic, which offered teen-only hours once a week, I started to understand the connection between KGA's wellness campaign and the commonplace brutalization of KGA's youth, especially Long Beach's youth, among whom I stood. When I shared what I witnessed with a few KGA staff, they immediately told me that Atlantic Avenue is a very well-known area where youth are surveilled, arrested, and entered into the state's gang database. The Long Beach Unified School District actively participates. Actively participates in the disciplining and criminalization of Black, Latino, Khmer, and other Southeast Asian youth. The KGA youth leaders who participated in the Every Student Matters campaign, and this was a multiracial alliance, Long Beach Building Healthy Communities, that took on this campaign. The KGA youth leaders' participation in the Every Student Matters campaign is a response to the elaborate architecture of punishment that creates the school to prison to detention center pipeline. This experience bears out Victor Rios's observation that school teachers and administrators, probation officers, and social workers are all implicated in constructing this architecture that funnels youth into correctional control, and for Khmer refugees triggers deportation. And this is an infographic that was generated as a part of the campaign, and you can see how high the suspension rates are. And in 2012, the school climate survey that was conducted as part of the campaign found that 9% of over 1,700 students, of the 1,700 students who participated, were arrested, at the school or near the school grounds. KGA did its own survey because, as you see that, even in those, in the infographic, the experiences of Khmer youth are missing. So they did their own participant action research report and found that, and they published it in Step Into Long Beach. It's a really great report. The researchers found that Khmer youth felt discriminated in school, with 47% reporting that they felt wrongly disciplined in their schools. Of the youth survey by KGA members, that was done by KGA members, 39% of young men reported that they were pulled over or stopped by law enforcement, and 21% reported that they were taken into police custody. The KGA's leadership pipeline provides its members with the tools to question and organize against this type of institutional violence. So this just shows, how daily that experience of being policed on the streets as they're trying to access education is. In the case of deportable Cambodian refugees, the State Department becomes a key player, and this is again, one limitation of the immigration reform framework. And this introduces the consideration of foreign policy into Southeast Asian anti-deportation organizing. Until 2002, incarcerated Cambodians, often transferred directly into the custody of immigration authorities, could not be deported. And so what happened was that they were languishing in these detention centers for years, and this sort of prolonged detention was actually challenged successfully. The case went up to the Supreme Court. But once the 2002 repatriation agreement was reached, folks started to be immediately deported. And the point I want to make here is that recall the State Department's advocacy role in pushing for Cambodian resettlement under the Carter administration. This ideological stance was actively promoted by Ronald Reagan as well. 2 decades later, the children who had served as posters for justifying the war against communism had turned into liabilities in the domestic war against crime, and yet again became the targets of the State Department's intervention. So I'll now transition into the deportation equals genocide section. And talk about a training that I attended on April 6, 2016, building up to preparing for the new year, which is actually, in my culture, our new year is also at that time, that April 14th and 15th period. So on April 5th, 2016, the Tuesday training with UOLB and KGPay was a time to prepare for the new year. It started with students playing a boisterous icebreaker designed to move our bodies and interact with each other. Like every other training, Sophia and Ashley unfurled a piece of butcher paper that said these words. And I was not quite prepared for that equation, for those bold letters on the butcher paper. I later discovered that KG8 had actually used this equation to frame its lessons and anti-deportation campaigns for years. Sophia led the facilitation that day. She asked the trainees to reflect on what the new year meant for families, their communities, and for the KG8. She then asked us to dwell on the two words of the butcher paper. One word was about a whole group of people being targeted for mass murder, and the other was about removal of migrants from their families and from their communities in which they grew up to be banished to another country. Could these two distinct types of violence be equated, she asked. And why were we talking about these issues like genocide and deportation in the celebratory context of the new year? The new year, the KGA youth said, was a time for family. It was an occasion to express pride in Khmer culture and identity. And Sophia added to this understanding by reminding us that it was also a time to mark all that the refugee community in Long Beach had gone through to escape war and genocide. It was a time to celebrate all that they had achieved. Furthermore, for 40 years, the celebration of the Khmer New Year has been fused with the fateful day in April 17, 1975, when the Khmer Rouge soldiers drove everyone out of Phnom Penh, inaugurating 4 years of torture, starvation, and death. Since then, the celebratory tone of the new year has been mingled with grief and loss, and this is was very much evident on Anaheim Street in Cambodia town, this sort of commemoration of the genocide along with the celebration of the new year. These assaults on family are inseparable from the loss of sons, daughters, and husbands to prisons and detention centers in the United States, and then post-2002 to their expulsion with no legal avenue for the deportees to return. Refugee parents are once again separated from their sons and daughters whom they had snatched from death in the face of the carpet bombing and as well as the Khmer Rouge's genocidal policies, and they raise these children in violence-racked cities like Long Beach. And this time they enfold their adult children and bless them and wish them a safe journey as they leave, they're forcibly expelled from the United States. And then many of the children who made this perilous journey are themselves parents who are faced with the prospect of being indefinitely separated from their families. Lest we relapse into what Asian American Studies scholar Kathy Schland-Wiles calls the Cambodia syndrome, it is important to remember, as KGA does, that the United States' fixation on the Cambodian genocide depends on its deliberate non-admission of US culpability before, during, and after the democratic Kampuchean era. And deportation equals genocide redirects our attention to the United States and its perpetuation of these traumatic practices which target families in the form of deportation. After the lesson in an interview that came toward the end of my visit, Sophia shared with me the story of her older sister, who is a former gang member and who was one of the earliest women to be put into deportation proceedings, and that was in 2003. And I use this story to illustrate the KGA's curricular emphasis on memory work in order to break down the ideological distinction between a benevolent United States and a genocidal Khmer Rouge, and also the distinction between families and felons. Sophia is a second-generation Khmer American herself, and she had just graduated high school and entered after completing the KGA's leadership program and was working in the organization when they got notified of her sister's impending deportation. And at that time, the KGA was a fledgling organization, and it had to put in place a rapid response system in order to deal with the deportation crisis that was unfolding in the Cambodian community. Sophia is one of 6 children. Her mother and older siblings had migrated to Long Beach as refugees. And as a single parent, Sophia's mother supported her children by working long hours in a Chinese restaurant. Sophia remembers moving a lot when she was growing up, and she wryly remarks that she has lived everywhere, in Long Beach except for the affluent East Side. Her older sister, who was 3 or 4 years old when they moved to Long Beach, had a difficult transition. Reflecting on the challenges her sister must have faced, Sophia said, and I quote, "Now that I know that it was in the 90s and it must have been hard growing up, especially having to resettle and assimilate here in Long Beach during the 90s when gang violence in the community was really high, and not knowing or having a sense of who you are, your culture and identity. In this social ecology of neglect, Sophia's sister got involved in a gang. Since her sister was the oldest, she took care of her younger siblings and took them everywhere, including, visiting her friends in the gang. And talking about gang members, Sophia pointed out, these people were family. They were family to my sister, family to us, she pointed out. Eventually, her sister was arrested and she cycled in and out of prison. In fact, one of her children was born in prison and is fostered by one of Sophia's older sisters. The details of exactly how her family learned about her sister's transference from prison to an immigration detention center are hazy for Sophia. She remembers that it was sudden and unanticipated, and she snapped her fingers to communicate the speed with which the deportation regime had kicked in after the 2002 repatriation agreement. Her sister was one of the first women with refugee status to be put into deportation proceedings. And the questions that arose in her family's mind was, how was she going to be treated in the detention center? How was she going to be treated by the Cambodian government if she were to be deported? And basically, Sophia's family dropped everything because the deportation hearing was in Northern California and they lived in Southern California. And they would make day trips out to fight for their sister's asylum case. Sophia's father, who at that time was struggling with terminal cancer, lived in Fresno, and he gave testimony in court. Sophia did not know him well since he had been long divorced from Sophia's mother. Sophia recalls the intensity of that moment. She prefaced it by saying deportation of criminal aliens was a wedge issue at that time in the Cambodian community, and gang members did not cut sympathetic figures. But she observed there is so much more behind it if you connect the history. Her wheelchair-bound father provided that living history in front of the immigration judge. And here I'll read a long excerpt from Sophia's interview with me. Sophia recounts that day in court. "I remember that was the last thing my dad did before he passed away. Because, it was really hard to see him in a wheelchair and having to talk about what happened to him. Just like the video, New Year's Baby, that we watched in the training. We filed for asylum, and that is why my father told his story. So my sister had to file saying, if she were to go back, it would be an endangerment to her because my father fought against the Khmer Rouge. My father had to tell the story. I had never heard that story until that day in court. Till this very day, I couldn't even. I stepped out of the room because I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle seeing him in that condition. I never really knew my dad because my parents were divorced. But the moment my sister got detained, he was like, what do you need to do? Because that's his daughter. Then when he told the story, I was like, I can't be in this room. This is the first time ever hearing him talk about it. I can't imagine what he was going through. But Sophia exposes the multiple layers of violence. She connects the violence of her family's dislocation from Cambodia with the combined violence of institutional neglect and active criminalization of refugee youth on resettlement. She draws on the gendered effects of these structures and let me just find my page here. She draws on the gendered effects of these structures on women. To grasp the horror of these enactments, one does not need the details unbearable to Sophia that her father presented to the judge. Sophia's witnessing of the intergenerational pain and scarring exceeded in an encapsulation in words, inviting those who hear Sophia's account to recognize a sadistic will to know, characteristic of voyeuristic hearings in immigration courts. and a refusal on part of Sophia and her family to submit to the power knowledge constitution of a failed refugee subject who has to testify seeking asylum in the United States yet again. Because remember, they've gone through the asylum process before. The space that eludes enunciation has been identified by Grace Cho in the case of the Korean diaspora as a haunting, and by Katharia in her textured analysis of the making of the Cambodian diaspora as refugee refusal. Sophia's recoiling from the layered violence is another manifestation of this non-compliance. Sophia's sister's asylum case is still pending. Her documents are impounded by the Department of Homeland Security, and without her green card, she's not authorized to work. So she works under the table. She's undocumented, and one of her sisters fosters all her children. And it's obvious that this whole process is deeply gendered, and I can talk a little more about that maybe in Q&A. How Sophia explained this as reproductive fighting for her sister as being about gender justice, refugee justice, and reproductive justice. But I wanted to transition to another, the last part of my question, and I want to sort of use this as the bridge by pointing out, and this I've written about elsewhere, that the affective call, the power of KGA's call to keep families together lies not in any innate goodness of the family form, but in the welling up of the grief lying very near the surface in those who are separated indefinitely from incarcerated or deported loved ones. These separations reopen wounds inflicted by the United States and the Khmer Rouge on Cambodian refugees. Added to the state-designed deaths was the prolonged separation and disappearance of family members fleeing the Pol Pot regime, and that was also attended by the chaos in the refugee camps. These disappearances still haunt the parents and grandparents of many of the KGA students with whom I did the training. The KGA's naming of deportation as a form of genocide cannot but call attention to Tongva battles in the present to secure sacred and burial sites in the face of ongoing settler colonial logics. Coexisting but not intersecting with KGA's efforts to name the multiple forms of genocide across space and time are Tongva struggles in Long Beach against the United States' ongoing genocidal efforts directed against them. The KGA's analysis effectively intervenes in the controlling image of the killing fields as the only site of genocide by implicating US imperialism in the creation and treatment of Khmer refugees who were resettled in a space constructed by settler colonial forms of genocide and racialized capitalism. To write against these colonial imperial logics requires foregrounding the practices of cultural revival, particularly the introduction of Tongva culture to youth, acts of remembrance through art, navigation, ceremony, and storytelling, and the protracted battles to protect burial sites from real estate development. Khmer and Tongva experiences of genocide, dispersal, and intergenerational trauma and resilience have resonances for sure. At the same time, Khmer and Tongva struggles are distinct. Khmer struggles emerge from the forced displacement stemming from imperialism abroad, then failed resettlement on lands occupied serially by the Spanish, by Mexico, and the United States. Tongva struggles are rooted in dispossession through the waves of colonial settlement. Just a few miles away from Cambodia town on the California State University Long Beach campus, Tongva activists and scholars and cultural practitioners continue to fight the dispossession of their land and the related assaults on their culture by warding off commercial development of a sacred site and burial ground on the western corner of the campus. So the Puvungla site, the picture that I showed you, the photograph, is that site, and it was cleaned up and beautifully decorated for the ancestor walk to end there. In 1974, the site of the village was listed under the National Register of Historic Places as a result of the efforts of Tongva organizers and their allies. They succeeded in getting CSULB to designate the site as a historic site, and which, in the words of, and the site is seen as sacred, and in the words of Claudia Germain, who is Tongva, is a sacred place then and now, where the omnipotent first chief was born, and where the people were given their laws to live on the land and take care of it. In the early 1990s, the CSULB proposed to commercially develop the 23 acres of land that was designated as sacred to us, and the development was going to be used to build a strip mall. The plan threatened to desecrate burial grounds in the land. Members of the Tongva community and their allies again organized protests. Cindy Alvitre, who is an American Studies professor at CSULB, and poet and writer Gloria Arianes, who was on the ancestor walk that I went on, recounted the struggles mounted by tribal members, community activists, students, and faculty in their conversations with Claudia Germain and William Macaulay. Many Tongva activists refused to leave the site. Alvitre recalled her brother camping on the land for 18 months between 1993 and 94 as a form of protest, and plaintiffs within the Tongva community sued the university. The plans for developing the site were suspended in 1995, but the CSULB has not returned the land to the tribe. Related to the community's reflection and recovery of meanings and ties to Puvugna are those for some measure of tribal sovereignty. And these local struggles then reveal the sort of ties of Tongva people to the land and the continuing exercise of Tongva sovereignty to fight settler colonial practices of dispossession, through which the university reserves its right to use land by reinforcing private property rights. So I'm going to conclude now. Sorry it was so long. The memory work required to excavate the United States imperial ventures abroad and settler colonial violence at home need to be multidirectional. The mode of inquiry stimulated by KGA's leadership programs call into question U.S. benevolence by exposing the structural violence that created the failed refugee turned deportable criminal alien. Contending with Tongva presence and struggles in Long Beach brings to surface the violence of settler colonialism on which the materiality of refugee resettlement depends. Chickasaw scholar Jody Burr reminds us, in geographical localities of the Americas, and I quote, where histories of settlers and arrivants map themselves onto and on top of indigenous peoples, understanding colonialism as a cacophony of contradictorily hegemonic and horizontal struggles offer an alternative way of formulating and addressing the dynamics that continue to affect people as they move and they are made to move within empire. In seeking those horizontal points of contact as a migration scholar, I do not want to create an isomorphism between the struggles of Khmer refugees and those of Tongva. Nor am I suggesting natural grounds for solidarity between these two groups of survivors. The KGA curriculum and organizing that the Siafin and One Love movement platform underscore, sorry, let me read that again. The KGA curriculum and organizing and the Siafin and One Love platform underscore the hollowness and the impossibility of the gift of U.S. permanent residency. And Audra Simpson has written about how Mohawks refuse the gift of U.S. citizenship and the passport as well. Tongva resistance against land development and desecration has mounted for decades, regardless of federal recognition. Drawing on Audra Simpson's work, I see this intergenerational will to protect land, culture, the living, and ancestors as an expression of this refusal. It is a refusal to be short-circuited by U.S. settler colonial power that claims the power to decree which indigenous nations can be recognized and which cannot. The Tongva and Khmer struggles are distinct because the political projects are distinct. For Tongva people, the struggle against U.S. imperialism centers on the restoration of cultural and political sovereignty. For Khmer refugees, struggles focus on the restitution, on restitution for the conditions fomented by the United States that created them. And these span transnationally in Cambodia as well as in the United States. My effort in this chapter about KGA is focused on writing about how Khmer resettlement and the creation of the refugee turned deportee. My intention is to write about it in order to remember the United States genocidal acts. In writing about the multiple registers of political violence wrought on Khmer people, I try to keep in mind the Tongva exercises of sovereignty in the presence, the cultural resurgence, the protection of sacred sites, the struggle over federal recognition, the re-education of Tongva youth to revalue their culture through practices, and the grieving for the long history of forced separation of young children from their families. the scars of which continue to open up in the present through intergenerational transmission of trauma. While grounds for solidarity may or may not emerge between the two groups, juxtaposing the two movements helps us unmask the imperial settler colonial nature of the US state. So that's, sorry, I didn't say that. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you want to take your own questions, or would you like a...
I can take my own questions. Thanks.
I really appreciate the connections you made between indigeneity and the struggle around refugee/deportation. I'm wondering, is that a connection that the youth or organizers of KGA have made, or is that just something that you as a scholar are doing?
Sure. Do you have to run or?
No, but
Okay. Yeah, the KGA doesn't directly make those connections, even though it's very aware of indigenous presence in California, especially Southern California. In an interview that I did as early as 2009 with a lead organizer in, it's called the Mekong Project now, and Eric Tang has written about this organization in New York. When I did an interview with the lead organizer there, she mentioned the sort of connections between Native American efforts to heal from their trauma and the ongoing effects of genocide on them and what the Khmer youth were going through. So definitely I think those connections are there in terms of political ideology and, looking for coalitions and kinship even. However, I think that each group is fighting its distinct battles and they haven't come together. There is one part, that I discovered in my field notes, as I was talking to the executive director of KGA, which was when she commented on how few resources had been put into the Long Beach Cambodian community in order for them to deal with genocide. And they had tried to reach out to Jewish groups, who were, better resourced in terms of dealing with, the Holocaust and also the education that accompanies that. But it was very interesting to me that they didn't talk about indigenous people and their genocides, even as these spaces come up against each other and they nestle against each other. So I think that is something that needs to develop in their politics. I struggle in this work. I struggle with it a lot because in some ways, because of my location in Hawaii, in many ways, I'm sort of excavating these connections, and I think that the immigrant rights activists, the anti-deportation activists, are very sympathetic to these fights and struggles, and even participate in them beyond being sympathetic. But they haven't figured out a way to weave that into their immigrant rights politics.
Yeah, actually, thank you for this really wonderful presentation, and also for drawing attention to what remains a largely under-attended community topic. My question has to do with methodology, and I was very struck by your reference to this observation participation kind of approach.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could share some of your strategies in sort of preserving, or at least preserving the space for the youth, and minimizing the potential risk of intrusion, right, that comes up with observation.
So we talked about that a lot when I, approached KGA to come and visit with them, they were. Very clear, other than the fact that these were teenagers and you had to do a whole different sort of IRB permission. We talked about the very long-term relationships that the staff had built with the youth, because it's a 3-year relationship, right? They also give rides to the youth back home because most of them are not able to, walk back home. And in those spaces, they develop a very intimate relationship. And I was also sort of, told about some of the, the lesson plans that would bring up these emotions. So we kind of mutually agreed that observation would be the best method. So, I a lot of times I wouldn't even participate in the icebreaker. I would sit in the corner. I mean, when I first went in, I would Ashley introduced me to each group and why I was there, and I talked a little bit about my project and what I do. And before the training, because these folks would come straight from school, there would be a hangout space in the lounge. And so we would just, they would do homework and we would just hang out, we'd listen to music. So that way I got to know a lot of the youth. And slowly toward the end of my visit, they wanted to, have me join their circles, and they wanted me to play the icebreakers with them, and even be part of that picture, the last sort of New Year's picture that I took with them. And I was very careful about the fact that I was going to leave in a year. And what I do is I send care packages with with Hawaiʻi kind snacks, every 3 months or so, because they really love snacking in the lounge. And it's a way for some of those who are moving through the program in the next 2 years to remember me. And then when I went back to the forum, I connected with a lot of the young people. But yes, definitely, I do carry their stories, which I don't, necessarily reveal. So most of the material that are direct quotes are all from the staff that I interviewed. I don't put in any materials at all that came out of the discussions in the groups. So what I observed was, for example, they would the trainers, they would put up a makeshift gallery, of how the Cambodian War, what built up to it, the sort of the bombardment of the land, the destruction of the land, the refugee camps. And, I would move with them to watch to see this gallery, right? And then I would observe their reactions and responses, just little things like they would just dwell in front of, how many million tons of bombs were dropped on Cambodia, or on the Mekong River, which, there was a little caption that said, this is a river through which many of your relatives had to swim. They had to contend with its force, trying to run to safety. So, I kind of restricted my role to that. And it was a very sweet relationship that we developed, and they would always ask me about Hawaii. And they would ask me how I liked Long Beach. And, they were quite, excited that I was living on Orange Street, and they would tell me about, where I could get good food and things like that. So there was a lot of chit chat and, sort of camaraderie, but never in a way that I would write about here. The last few trainings, we were all crying together because it was so emotional for all of us to see, the movie Do Your Baby, and then to process it in group. Yeah, again, I was outside of it, but we all were in the room as the discussions happened. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it a lot. I'm from Austria, it's south of Germany, and I'm not posing a question, actually, more an idea for future research questions.
Yeah.
I'm interested in. It's like back home in Austria, but also in Germany, there are quite a lot of anti-deportation practices and organizations emerging and going on, and also, of course, in reaction of racist deportation practices, because we have a lot of people because of the Syrian war from Syria, because they take the Balkan routes in Europe, and also people from different countries too, who are framed as economic migrants, but actually are refugees because they cannot go back, otherwise they will be killed or tortured, whatever. So life-threatening things. So I was just wondering, for future idea or research questions, in a way, a comparison, between, let's say, Europe, deportation or anti-deportation organization strategies, and here, I don't know, it just came up.
Yeah.
Because my friends are we are involved in these things, not only as researchers, but also as activists.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of comparative work actually is being done. And at this moment, what is really interesting for me is that we used to look at EU at one point, as sort of, the open borders people, right? They would be like, oh, no borders in EU, There was a kind of, sort of, I would say, an American kind of valorization of the EU sort of migration policies, right? Even though we had a critique of the temporary guest worker policies, especially when it came to the Turkish migrants in Germany. So, but at this moment, it's so stark, right? That there is this opposition against against any kind of migration. It's pretty very apparent. And then the other thing is that, when I was in Munich for a few days for a conference, and, as I stepped out of the subway in front of the, I think, Ludwig Maximilian University, there was a big, huge sign that said, no human is illegal.
Yeah.
And, they were doing education and things like that. So obviously you wouldn't have those signs unless there is this kind of, xenophobic racism that is, operative in that space, right? So now with Britain withdrawing from the EU, I think we are becoming, at least US migration scholars are becoming much more critical of, this idea that we would need an EU type kind of, system for US, Mexico, and Canada at least, in order to just eliminate the difficulty of passing through borders. It's a really poignant and important moment, and I think more, certainly comparative work needs to be done. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was really, really fascinating, and I kept coming back to this thought that there seems to be so much of a parallel between what you're describing and Central American communities, and I was wondering if there were any efforts by KGA to connect with local groups like Garrison or any other group like that.
Yeah. So KGA works very closely with the youth justice, the folks who are working with incarcerated youth and youth who are in juvenile detention centers, as well as immigrants based in LA. And they've done a lot on gang injunctions and, sort of understanding, sort of piecing together how gang injunctions work in neighborhoods. It's very closely allied with Homies Unidos. It is, it goes into, LA is, you may be familiar with this, LA is a city of coalitions. Like everybody knows everybody in the movement, and there is sort of this, kind of like a no borders thing that goes on, like people are just like flowing into these spaces and doing a particular project and then pulling out. So KGA was involved with Caresen and others in sort of responding to the 2007, Senate bill to really foreground refugee justice, economic justice, agenda, and kind of like, doing a lot of popular education around, why immigration reform and this narrow, demand that legalize those who are undocumented is inadequate, because that doesn't work for the Central American, refugees either. So they are very familiar with, those organizations, and I think that there's been quite a bit of cross training and cross learning in terms of how to cope, how to build resources, how to cope with deportation, and definitely the policing and surveillance of their communities and putting them into gang databases. Yeah.
I have one question. Kind of building off of that last discussion, KG seems pretty radical, and I know that a lot of quote-unquote youth-serving organizations face a lot of pressures around fundraising and, placating donors and so on, and, let's make it about boosting test scores or whatever the ideology of the day is. So I'm wondering if, I know this is a little bit outside the scope of your talk, but I'm just curious, how they maintain this in this climate and where they get their money.
Yeah, they do a lot of community-based fundraisers. They also are extraordinarily good about entering into coalitions, like the big coalition around the Wellness Center and the Every Student Matters campaign. And the funding comes to this large coalition, right? And then KGA gets a piece of it for doing its own, organizing work and its trainings. The staff, I think they're paid mostly with the money that they raise, and foundation money. I know for a fact that foundation money is drying up. And they have, frequent retreats about how to keep this philosophy intact, while also surviving and expanding, because the needs are so grave right now. So one of the things that they often talk about is the ways in which they sort of represent themselves, which is not a misrepresentation, is that they are a community-based organization that works in Long Beach and contends with economic poverty, with environmental degradation, and these have pockets of money from the state. And over the years, they have cultivated very savvy and good relationships with city council people, and so they can tap those resources in ways. But they really struggle with funding. I know that for a fact. Yeah. I didn't ask them directly about the funding issue, even though I wanted to. But, yeah.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. And I had two questions. I know we're running out of time, but I'll try to make them quick. First, I was really interested in thinking about what these youths kind of broader ideas about emigration and deportation are in terms of kind of connections to different generations. So I'm thinking in particular of a comparison to, for example, the dreamers who are positioning themselves as kind of deserving of being able to stay in the kind of complicated relationships that then creates with maybe their parents or grandparents. And I was wondering, given this is a different kind of situation being resettled here in the United States as refugees, how that might compare. And then I also was curious about kind of the gendered ways in which these students are brought into this organizing space, especially in this moment when we see so much of a move towards more fluidity and flexibility around questions of gender identity.
So I think you kind of answered the question yourself in terms of how KGA's work really radically departs from sort of a dreamer agenda. At the same time, when I push them on it, they are supportive of that agenda. They'll never publicly say that, oh, that's junk. So, but at the same time, they have developed what Chaya Chon calls a refugee voice, which is to say that legalizing undocumented people is definitely an urgent thing on the agenda, but what is happening to us is a little bit different. So that's why the State Department becomes a player and a target for the Southeast Asian social justice organizations. They also sort of talk about the fact that some of these, like Sophia's sister, some of them may have had legal permanent residency and then become undocumented, right? And they have aged out of any kind of DACA benefits, so which anyway may be eliminated. So what about those folks? Do they then become join the ranks of other sort of say Mexican immigrants who are DACA eligible or fighting for DACA? So they really ask these questions themselves in terms of how they can support these struggles while also lifting up their issues. And part of deciding to write a chapter, because I didn't even think of writing a chapter on this. I did an interview in 2009 that really stuck with me, and then I realized that I should really do more with this because this is so intense, and so that was my decision to go to KGA and develop this chapter. But they will always kind of say that it's very important to understand peculiarities of refugees, which have a lot in common with, Central American refugees as well. The distance is different, the repatriation agreements are different, but, some of the same kinds of issues in terms of being inserted into degraded environments and into, ecologies of urban neglect. So, and the second question was the gendered ways in which there is a ways in which the KGA youth enter. So, they're 14-year-olds, and there's a lot of discussion of both gender and sexuality, and gender variance, as well as, gay, lesbian, transgender, identities. And this is really attended to and nurtured and cultivated in that space in a very, very sweet and very intimate way. So, folks, they do a lot of training and exercise. They make masks, and one mask exercise was, how do you appear to the world, and then inside show how do you feel inside. So, through these kinds of exercises, they kind of, really express a variety, like their intersectional identities. And I think it's one of the rare organizations that really puts to work intersectionality in their political organizing.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but Professor Das Gupta can stay for a few minutes if anyone has other questions, but let's thank her for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thanks.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yes, thank you. I'm still working to, make the photographies with the other piece better.
Anything
So, yeah.
you can support us.